The Spencer Island John Doe, identified as Gary Haney. It started in January of 1979 on Spencer Island near Marysville, Washington, when a man was out hunting. That man would discover someone in the tide flats near Spencer Island, finding someone stuck in the fishing lines. But who he was and why he was there would stump law enforcement. They couldn't even determine the COD. Over the years, they would do dental films and keep records, but with so many of these cases, the written records just disappeared, lost in storage, or were thrown away. It's hard to say what exactly happened. We know there was more work done, but like the original records from 1979, everything in the 1980s sort of disappeared. The coroner's office converted to a medical examiner's office in 1987. And from that point on, better records were kept, but it was too late for the Spencer Island Doe. Back then, they tended to bury the person. Later on, they would exhume him from what was originally assumed would be his final resting place in 2015 in hopes of finding DNA. They redid his dentals, this time in putting them into a database, but they didn't turn up any matches. A forensic artist named Natalie Murray would do a recreation based on facial morphology. Facial morphology is a series of many different complex traits, each influenced by genetic and environmental factors. Often the recreations are the largest stepping stone to identification. They would keep trying to identify the man, placing him between 5'2" and 5'6" and 27 to 61 years old. They knew he had an unset, well-healed left femur fracture, and that he must have walked with a limp because of this. His DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2018, but again, there were no matches. This would lead to a more advanced DNA profile being drawn up in 2021. One different thing about this is it wasn't GEDmatch, so it was the newest form of checking that led to the answer, and that is family tree DNA. My DNA is in both of these, and to be honest, family tree is so much better, in my opinion. So it's exciting that this is being used more. It's easier to see what matches are connected, or at least easier for a novice like me. They finally traced the ancestors to Everett, Washington in the late 1970s, finding a branch that would lead to Gary Lee Haynie's half-sister. She would explain that Gary was around 29 when he went missing. I'm going to do the best I can to include photos of him, but currently all I have are photos where he was a lot younger from his grandmother's photo album. And anytime I use younger photos or mention an age that's a lot younger, YouTube shuts off comments because the idea is to avoid those in that age group from being bullied. But obviously, my videos are not that. But there's no way to protest. So I'm going to do the best I can to include photos of him, but if there's no photos in here, that is why. If they shut off the comments, it tanks the video completely. Nobody even sees it. If Gary was reported missing, it was lost just as his records were over those years. As they needed genetic DNA, his femur was mailed to Othram Labs in hopes that would lead to an identification. And after 44 years, Gary's name was announced on March 3, 2023. Gary was born in Topeka, Kansas, traveling the world with his mother and adoptive father, because his father was in the Air Force. However, his parents have since passed, and no one really knows exactly how Gary even disappeared, much less how he came to be where he was found. The photos of Gary are scarce and hard to come by, but I'll dig again when I'm editing the audio, and if more appear online that I find, I'll include it in this video. We know that Gary was born Gary Joseph Condomiti. His brother divorced Gary's father, marrying Sheldon Haney, who would adopt Gary as his own. Gary's biological dad passed when Gary was 16. But Gary stepped away from his family, and some of them believe he was struggling with his mental health. Sheldon Haney lived in Everett, Washington from the early 1970s until 1990. No one really knows where Gary was. He may have been living with Sheldon, or Sheldon may have known where he was, but it was never stated to anyone else. We know that the family legally declared Gary deceased in 1976, but that he didn't actually pass until 1979. So tracing him to late 1978 may give the best answers. The weird thing is, too, that Sheldon never mentioned Gary or his absence If anyone knows what happened to him or how he ended up where he was found, please contact the number on the screen. Gary Lee Haynie went unidentified for 44 years. Had he lived, he would be 73 years old today. Before I start this video, I just want to say thank you to all of you who have consistently commented on the videos here. It's the engagement that makes a huge difference, and the channel finally has 10,000 subscribers, which took about 2 years and 200 videos to reach, so I want to thank everybody. The Linn County Jane Doe, identified as Grace Narvaez-Weaver. In April of 2020, the remains of a woman were found in an extremely remote area. This was a wooded area off of U.S. Forest Service Road in Linn County, Oregon. This was about 13 miles east of Sweet Home, Oregon. While it was essentially in the middle of nowhere, it's still somewhat well-traveled, approximately 5 miles into Gordon Road, off of U.S. Forest Service Road 417. If they knew her COD, they didn't release it. So it's not clear if they believed it to be foul play. Sometimes they hold off on this, waiting for the person's identity before they dig into anything else related to the case, so that might be the reason. The authorities would release that they believed she was white, around 30 to 50. With these newer cases, they are quicker to use DNA to try to identify them. Bode technology has a great ability to make a likeness based on her genetics. This was the image that they built up. Usually they're pretty close as far as what the person looks like. It's a pretty incredible tool, actually. In addition to this, her DNA was added to CODIS in hopes of identifying her, but there were no hits. They eventually resorted to genetic genealogy in late 2022, eventually announcing on March 8, 2023, that the woman was in fact Grace Lorna Narvaez-Weaver. In this case, Grace was last seen at the post office in July of 2019, but not in Oregon. Rather, she was seen in Olympia, Washington, which is about 200 miles away. Grace was dealing with an undisclosed type of mental illness. Her loved ones were missing her and wanting to know if she was okay. They did report her missing once it was clear they couldn't find her, but even that is a little up in the air since she didn't have a home to look for her at. Like so many before her, Grace was living on the streets and struggling. That often leads to a gap in time before the report happens. Her family reported that Grace was 47 when she went missing in 2019. Grace had a seizure disorder and she required medication, which understandably worried them when she disappeared. The last time they saw her, she was in the company of a man that they didn't know. So far, they haven't released anything about the man, such as a sketch, but if anything comes up before I finalize the video, it will show up right here. I always like to warn you because sometimes then my audio won't match up with what you're seeing. If anyone knows anything about Grace and what she was up to at the time, please contact the number on your screen. It doesn't appear she had a vehicle and she made her way to Oregon somehow. The investigation into her case is still ongoing. Grace Weaver went unidentified for 2 years. She was missing for 3. She was found 200 miles away from where she went missing. Had she lived, she would be 50 years old today. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. So if you enjoy the content here and you're not sure, take a peek to see if you're subscribed. Take care of yourselves and each other.